Crisis Control, brought to you by Xerilio. Cybersecurity experts protecting Australian businesses and organisations so we can all be safer together.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Crisis Control, our last for 2022, and a deeper dive into what's been an incredible year in cybersecurity and more broadly, the technology ecosystem. I'm Nadine Blayney from AusBiz. Over the next hour, we'll be hearing from people who are on the front lines of cyber defense. Some are protecting your data from an increasing wave of attacks. Others have, some would say, the unenviable task of managing the risk and investment reputation of Australian businesses. Well, it was back in June this year when we first began Crisis Control. The first few episodes were dedicated to the premise that a major cyber attack in this country was looming.
Catch up is no good when the bad guys are moving faster.
Everybody is going to get hit.
About 70% of Australian businesses were having a problem with democratization of data.
If you really can mitigate the risk, you gain advantage and you gain consumer trust.
The opportunity for Australian organisations is really to explore those opportunities and start experimenting with the technology, albeit in a very safe way.
And how well polished were those crystal balls? 2022 has turned out to be the year of the hack. So what's next? And how do business, government, and regulators work together to protect us all? Joining me to discuss is Saunders, a partner at Thomson Geer, and Dave Maunsell. He's been working in the information security space for many years at the ASX, at Accenture, and he's now the CEO of Haventec. Both of you, welcome to Crisis Control. Thanks for joining us. Look, Optus and Medibank obviously have been the headline-grabbing huge hacks of the year. Data theft, which of course is the worst that we can imagine from both a corporate and consumer level. But the level of cybercrime had actually been steadily rising in Australia. Up to June 30th, it was up by about 14%. Why is that?
Well, on average, according to NordPass, we now have, each of us, 100 usernames and passwords that we have to manage. That means we have 100 identities of one form or another and across a whole lot of businesses that we digitally interact with. And a lot of that information is protected by technology that's been, some of it came out of the 70s, some of it came out of the 80s, and it's coming under a lot of pressure being connected to the internet and being connected to a zone where people are looking to get access to our personal information for their own gain. And I think we're seeing the consequences now of approaches that we've applied in the past to collect personal information coming under attack and not withstanding that attack. And as a consequence, we're seeing our personal information, unfortunately, leak into the hands of people that we haven't authorised to have access to it.
Is it wrong to assume that Australian companies or Australia is being disproportionately targeted?
Look, we're not an outlier. You cluster the Western nations as those who are more targeted by some of the actors that are seeking to get unauthorised access to our information, and they're targeting the Western countries because high population wealth, and they're looking to transfer value. And so, while we're not top of the league's table, I'm not sure. Maybe that'd help us accelerate some of the things that we need to do as a nation to address some of the problems we've got. But we're in a cluster of countries who are, because of our wealth, are targeted more than others.
Transfer of value, it's all about the dollars.
That's right.
When you think, Marlia, of cybercrime and the headline-grabbing incidents that have happened this year here in Australia, it does make us feel a bit vulnerable, doesn't it? How are corporates sort of sitting up and taking notice?
Well, I think the media is really taking notice of these recent cyber breaches, cyber attacks. It's being reported on, I think, more than it has been in a long time. We've had a mandatory data breach reporting scheme in Australia for around 4 or 5 years now, but many of those incidents weren't really picked up by the media, and I think now, since the Optus and Medibank incidents, it's really getting a lot of coverage, which I think is increasing education for businesses and for consumers as well.
So the silver lining, so to speak, from some of these big headline-grabbing hacks?
Well, the silver lining is that awareness goes up. And then, individuals within organisations who have been seeking priority and budget to make the changes they know are necessary to protect the information they're responsible for, they're more likely to get it now, and in a climate that's seeing this as a priority. I think some of the regulatory changes that have gone through, it'll be interesting to see the impact that the Privacy Act changes have. Certainly a larger stick is going to have more board members paying attention to what's going on. But I think the changes like CPS 234 for APRA-regulated entities and the board now having some explicit responsibilities around information security, making it quite personal, means that our senior leaders need to lean into this topic and need to take it and need to give it the priority that it requires. Because at the moment, if we continue to rely on the technology we're relying on and the processes we're relying on and the procedures we're relying on to keep our sensitive information safe, we've already got enough data to know that ain't working.
Yeah, I think that these higher potential penalties are going to mean that companies are more likely to invest in enhancing their cyber protection and updating what may have been rushed through during COVID as well. There was this massive transition in a very quick period of time to work from home, and so a lot of technology solutions were kind of speeded up and rushed through, and maybe that exposed some vulnerabilities as well. So I think it's really important now for businesses to be looking at that and investing in that and really making sure that they're prepared for potential penalties that they may be hit with if there is a data breach going forward once these laws are passed.
Because there's two ways that you can deal with cyber, right? You can do it through legislation, what the government does, and also what businesses do. So there's two ways to sort of look at that equation. There was $40 million put toward cyber resilience in the most recent federal budget. I mean, is that even, what is the scale of the government response that is needed and investment from government?
Well, on the legislative piece, back to regulation. Regulation's not going to perfect the problem. It's somewhat perverse when you think regulation are expecting organisations to do something that technology can't quite do, which is, and again, I agree with you. I think the higher fines are going to see behaviours change around investment priorities within both enterprises, government and non-government. Do I think that the $40 million is going to be the drop in the ocean we require to start to genuinely protect this information? I don't know. And actually, but I do hold, outside of the numbers, I actually do hold hope on what initiatives like Victor Dominello did with the new decentralised digital identity with Service New South Wales, because that's a team thinking about the future, thinking about do we as New South Wales citizens need 100 username and passwords, or do we need one that we're in control of? And that's the type of thinking we need, and could programs like that benefit from some of the 40 million? I know I as a citizen could, so I'm hoping some of it gets channeled that way.
The Medibank hack was unique, I suppose, so far in that we saw a multi-agency response to the crisis. Why has that taken so long? I'm not sure I have a fully informed, I don't know if I can be drawn on that particular one.
I can't say why, I can say it should have happened earlier.
Okay, yeah.
There's been these massive cyber attacks happening overseas for the last couple of years, and it was only a matter of time before we started seeing these big ones, big high profile ones in Australia. So I think it's encouraging that this permanent task force, joint operation has been put in place with members of the Australian Signals Directorate and the AFP banding together. I think that that's really important, and proactively trying to fight cybercrime and stop it from happening. It's great, but I think it's overdue. Yeah,
we talk about these most recent headline-grabbing hacks, but I mean, this is not new, Dave. This has been happening for quite some time.
Yeah, look, unfortunately not, and it's somewhat ironic that in the last couple of decades, when technology has advanced, so has all of the breaches of our personal data. So if you track it over time, technology advancements and the amount of data that's ended up in the hands of people that shouldn't have access to it, both of those things seem to be growing at a similar rate. So unfortunately, yeah, it's not a new phenomenon. I think what's interesting, with the Medibank piece, and while it's frustrating, and we've got a couple of my team members who are impacted by this particular breach, and I'm seeing them go through the process of trying to recover bits of their digital lives, and while it's painful, a lot of the data they've lost is somewhat disposable. Username and a password, you go and get a new one. Birth date, less so. What's going to happen next in the health space is a lot more of our health data is going to end up online, and they're immutable data sets. They're information that we cannot afford to lose. Individuals that are using biometrics to sign into information now, if their biometric templates get stolen, you've only got 10 of those, and then after that you cannot rely on that information anymore. So I think what's the key takeaway, certainly from us and for some of our clients, is that the technology that organisations are relying on now to protect data, it's not working. There are more important data sets heading towards our digital lives, and we really do need to solve the problem of ensuring that that information is not defended but protected, and we as the owners of that data need to be in more control of its protection.
So does that also speak to decentralisation as well?
Oh, very much so. So that's certainly one of the key means to that many organisations and investments that I'm aware of in the Australian marketplace and in the US are going into design technology that doesn't centrally store sensitive information in the obvious location, but decentralises that information in a way that when that enterprise is breached, the perpetrator could get one, maybe two parts of a multi-part decentralised puzzle, and a puzzle that changes every time that information is accessed. Because at the moment we know that centrally storing sensitive information is between human error, unauthorised access attempts from rogue nations, and other attacks that are going on at the moment. It's unfortunately failing us.
Marlia, sort of a question without notice, but it's my understanding that privacy champions are on the rise in corporate organizations, media organizations as well, something that was very prevalent in government organizations and the public sector primarily. What is their role? How do you see their role?
I think that there can be complacency within organisations, and I think that there can be, there needs to be that education piece. So it's about educating staff on how to be responsible with their own, what they disclose online, the emails that they click on, all of that sort of thing. I'm getting bombarded by emails from my employer about this sort of thing. But there's a massive emphasis, I think, on education and taking responsibility for your own data, because I think there's a lot of trust given to platforms. Like people post a lot online, they upload a lot online, they trust that their information will be kept secure by these third parties, when really, as Dave said, there's issues there that need to be addressed. So
okay, and so this is what's the legalities around that when it comes to corporates? Obviously, we've got this new privacy legislation amendment bill being pushed through this year, or being adopted this year, but I mean, when it comes to the legal responsibilities of corporates and workplaces in terms of what's happening on the privacy front, what is it?
So there's these Australian privacy principles that organisations and government agencies need to comply with, and they're pretty high level, they're pretty general in nature. So from a security perspective, there's just an obligation to keep people's personal information that organisation holds secure, and to protect it from unauthorised disclosure and use.
That is a massive piece, isn't it, when it comes to those working within organisations as well?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a privacy officer in a large organisation that's responsible for holding a lot of sensitive information in centrally stored repositories, it's a tough job, because between awareness and process and procedures and the capability of the technology, there's a lot of things that need to be right constantly to ensure that the organisation delivers on their customers' expectations as it relates to the protection of that information and privacy. And for many organisations, I remain hopeful that while larger penalties for victims will not solve the problem, it will raise the priority of investment into areas that ultimately help safeguard that information and maybe close some of the gaps that exist around the way that information is currently protected.
And is that how you see it as well, Marlia? Because the government putting through these increased penalties is implicit in its view that just the suffering that the business and reputational damage that a business might go through is just, it's not enough.
Exactly, that's right. So they're really incentivising businesses to focus on this. And the amendments also give additional powers to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner as well to investigate data breaches and to impose fines and all of that sort of thing. So it's strengthening the regulatory side of things as well.
Now, I would like to just take a little bit of a detour right now to talk a little bit about frauds and scams. Dave, when it comes to frauds and scams, and I'm thinking about this from a corporate point of view, if your brand is being used to perpetrate some sort of fraud or scam, what responsibility do you have in that regard?
For many organisations, and I go back to the start, we've all got, on average 100 usernames and passwords that we use to digitally engage with these brands, which means that the edge of many organisations' networks are you and I. And more often than not, we're a bit of the soft spot. If somebody trying to get unauthorised access to a large bank here needs to go through the technology, there's lots of layers of complicated defence that, more often than not, thwart an unauthorised access attempt. So where are these scammers going? They're going to where they can socially engineer their way through the firewalls, and you and I are the weak spots. And so they're using, fairly old school, basic social engineering tricks to convince somebody at the other end of the line, a legitimate customer of a brand, to give them access to their accounts, and ultimately it's to transfer some value. So I think it's going to be important for brands, and we're seeing the brands do this now. So if you go to many banking sites here in the Australian marketplace, there's a scam page listed, and you can see what that brand's been targeted with. There's also ScamWatch here in the Australian marketplace, and certainly me as a practice, when I get something unsolicited that looks like a scam and probably is a scam, I just send it off to ScamWatch and get it registered with them, and they will then post that out, making other Australians aware of the fact that there's maybe a new scam on the block.
Yeah, and to your point, it's not just reputational damage, it flows down to your client experience, it also customer engagement, and then ultimately shareholders as well. But your point is that, look, it's sort of personal, it's up to you to manage your cyber security at a personal level, but it still goes back to those breaches and those hacks, because it's the data that is the starting point for a lot of these frauds and scams.
Well, as more information about us is made available on the dark web, and the Medibank data, the Optus data will be available there. They're the seeds that these scammers are using to start to generate a little bit of a picture of you and me. Then they contact you with information. And they'll say, when's your birthday? Yep, that's the correct birthday. Or I know your birthday because I've downloaded it from the data. And now all of a sudden, they're approaching that conversation with a level of credibility because they've got access to some of your personal data. And maybe I am dealing with somebody that's legitimately from the brand they're claiming to be. So the more data that ends up in the hands of people with unauthorised access, the more likely they will be able to take advantage of some fairly basic social engineering against the population.
All right, well, for a look back at the year of the hack and ahead as well, Marlia Saunders from Thomson Geer, thank you so much for joining us. And Dave Maunsell from Haventec, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, of course, Australia isn't the only market where data security has been front and center. And of course, this is all happening in the context of much broader disruption in big tech. Wyatt Roy is an executive director of the Technology Council and is speaking with Lawrence Patrick from Zerilia.
So we want to talk a little bit about 2022, which has been a massive year for the technology sector and technology industry. what are some of the big headlines that you think about as we sort of close the chapter on 2022 for tech?
Yeah, well, it's great to be here, and 2022 I think is sort of the peak of this amazing growth that we've seen in the technology sector. And I think if you think about what defines our time, it is that rate of change. It's not just that change is happening, but change is happening incredibly quickly, and the technology sector is at the forefront of that. So it's actually kind of good to go back and say, well, how far have we actually come in recent history? And if you think about our country, pre-COVID, we had nearly 30 years of uninterrupted economic growth. Totally amazing by global standards. That's delivered rising living standards, huge economic dividends for our country. And that was driven by a number of things. It was driven by economic reform, a whole bunch of different factors, but in large part it was driven by we have a whole bunch of resources in the ground and we live close to people that want to buy them. Where in the more recent period, what we've seen is the technology sector has moved from a sort of an important but not mainstay part of the Australian economy to absolutely become a central pillar of the Australian economy. So we know now the technology sector is the third biggest contributor to GDP behind mining and banking. It's the 7th largest employer in Australia. Throughout COVID, it was the second highest growing industry for jobs growth. And on sort of every indicator, Australia is now beginning to punch above its weight when it comes to the technology sector. So if you look at the number of unicorns, we have more unicorns than you would compared to our global GDP. In certain sectors, we are miles ahead when it comes to venture capital investment. We're a very long way ahead. To give some sense of perspective, back when I was in Parliament and Minister sort of responsible for the space, we used to talk about the period before then of about $200 million invested through venture capital into the technology sector. That's less than we bet on the Melbourne Cup, so to give you a sense. In the last few years that we know about, there's about $30 billion go into the sector. So we've seen this enormous growth in the tech sector, enormous growth in the employment numbers, and really shifting into the mainstay of the economy. And I think that's kind of really what will define our most recent period. And there's going to be a very interesting period going forward as there are some global trends. But I think it's important to recognise just how much success we've had in this sector.
Right. And let's talk about disruption. What do you see sort of in the roadmap for 2023, specifically with the Australian tech sector?
Yeah.
What are some of the emerging sort of trends and things that you see?
Well, I think we, like everyone in the world, live in a highly globalised economy, and you're going to be influenced by those big macro factors. We see inflation picking up, we see interest rates picking up, we see global uncertainty when it comes to energy, when it comes to the geopolitical arrangements with Russia and Europe, with China. And the tech sector is not immune to that. There's no doubt that there'll be changes, and we're seeing this when it comes to valuations, when it comes to all of those impacts on the sector and employment. But I think the amount of success that we have is not going to disappear. We might think about it in a slightly different way, but you're going to continue to see significant growth in the sector. If you just look at capital raised, I mean, even in recent weeks, we've seen $1 billion in a single VC fund raised. We've seen over $550 million in another. 5, 6, 7 years ago, you would never dream of those sorts of numbers. That capital is still sitting there. We still have amazing founders and amazing entrepreneurs creating these incredible companies. We have a growth in the STEM skill set and tech set in Australia. So I think there'll still be significant growth. Valuations might change. The sorts of companies that people value might change. Not values companies that are just focused on growth for growth's sake. And some of those trends inevitably will also be impacted by the global environment. So, for example, I think we'll see a real kind of doubling down on climate tech and energy tech, in part in response to the global environment when it comes to energy and geopolitics. And I think that's a great opportunity for our country. So I'm very excited about this sector, and frankly, this sector will help drive the Australian economy in a more difficult global environment.
And let's talk about investors and the capital that you mentioned in the venture sector. How do we increase the velocity of the deployment of that capital with early stage companies? One of the things that strikes me in comparing Silicon Valley to the Australian sort of market for early stage companies is just the velocity of the deployment of capital for very, very early stage companies. You know, Australian investors want to see a little more traction, a little more, you know, proof in the marketplace before putting big money in versus Silicon Valley. How do we sort of change that culture for the early stage investors in Australia?
It's a great question. I think when you compare any innovation ecosystem, whether it's Australia to Silicon Valley or another, Silicon Valley is amazing because of scale. You know, that really is the truth. You have enormous, you know, deep wells of capital sitting there. You have enormous sort of deal flow coming through. And so in that environment, if 0.1% of the companies are successful, you have this huge ecosystem. You can deploy lots of capital out of it. Where I actually think the more interesting comparison for us is when you compare on a per capita basis. So I would have thought a better comparison is perhaps to, you know, Israel, where you have the highest amount of VC per capita deployed of any nation on earth. You've got the highest number of startups per capita. And so on a per capita basis, and when you actually look at the numbers, we are, as I said, punching above our weight in terms of our share of global GDP. In terms of how you increase that velocity, I mean, it's an interesting question, but I mean, we have come off a low base incredibly quickly. And so I think the question is, how does that trend continue or accelerate? And the truth is, success feeds more success. And we are seeing that in this country today. So on the really early stage stuff, what you're seeing is more mature venture capital. So, you know, in the US, you will often see highly specialized VC around particular verticals because of scale. We're beginning to see parts of that in Australia as these funds are getting bigger and bigger, new funds are raised. Rather than just being a generalist, you're seeing more specialization in the investing environment, and I think that will deploy more capital in certain areas quicker and faster. I think one of the really big things is we have these amazing companies, really large, you know, they're not just unicorn companies. If you look at us globally, it's not that we're just producing more unicorns compared to our global GDP share, but we're producing unicorns with much, much, much higher valuations than competitors. And so in these very large companies, you know the names, Atlassian and Canva and Afterpay and Safety Culture, Go1, you're going to have a whole cohort of people, and this is already happening, who are now creating their own funds, their own angel investing into startups. There are people within those companies who might have been employee number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20, 30, who are leaving, you know, with a big sort of liquidity event and themselves either joining another company or starting another company. And so that ecosystem of new founders, new companies, new investors feeding off that success is really accelerating this. And I think that's not, it's not so easily understood, and it's certainly not just a linear path in this case. I think it does actually have an exponential sort of impact on the sector. So I think those factors, and frankly just the success that we already have, is going to supercharge that sort of deployment of capital and that investment, those new companies at the really early stage.
Right. So we know that cybersecurity is one of the sectors that is expanding very rapidly. For obvious reasons, there's huge demand, huge need, and we don't have enough people and cyber defenders to meet that need. So companies are expanding. There are a lot of new entrants in the space. Are there other sectors or there are other technology trends that you see where, you know, we're going to need more demand, we're going to need more support to really meet the need?
No, it's a great question, and I'm sort of always careful about picking winners, but there is definitely a trend here around certain sectors where we are really punching above our weight. So, you know, as a country, the most successful sector that we've had is B2B software, you know, large-scale B2B enterprise software. That sector I don't think is going to slow down in any sense. In the fintech space, we've done incredibly well as a country. There's huge demand sitting there. In AI, increasingly, we're doing better. If you look at our traditional strengths, so mining tech companies is the sector where we punch probably the highest globally in terms of new startups and technology startups in the mining tech space, so doubling down on our traditional strengths and applying technology to it. And then the final one that I think there's just so much sort of wind in the sails and so much opportunity is around the climate tech, energy tech space. And Australia has huge underlying strengths when it comes to that space. I mean, it's self-evident, we're the sunniest continent on the planet after Antarctica, we're the windiest continent on the planet after Antarctica, but we have really great knowledge there. If you look at the country's expertise, you know, traditionally we would rank in the highest countries in the world in the OECD for research, but when it comes to commercialization of those more deep tech industries, and climate tech's a great example, we rank quite low in the OECD. So that just says to me there's a great opportunity when you apply these other ingredients in the ecosystem to supercharge that sector. Just to give you a great example, in the solar industry, last year there was about $50 billion of sales in the solar industry using Australian IP. Very little of that was captured here, but modern solar was literally invented in Australia. For 30 of the last 40 years, the most efficient solar cells in the world were Australian IP. And I think increasingly we're going to see that sector grow and prosper here as, frankly, some of the economics change, and then also some of the other elements of the ecosystem come to bear. So huge opportunities in new areas for us.
Speaking of solar, just one last question. I know Robin Denholm, who is the chair of Tesla, one of the major solar manufacturers, as well as obviously a huge automaker globally. Famously, Elon Musk has talked about how important it is for Tesla to have the ability to manufacture cars on continent, and we don't have a Tesla gigafactory yet in Australia. What do you foresee on the horizon? Are we going to get our own gigafactory from Tesla anytime soon?
Well, I wouldn't want to speak for Tesla, but I think not yet is the right word. I think if you think about the realities of what is the opportunity, now whether we capture it as a country or not is up for grabs, but we have incredible natural resources sitting in this country. So if you think about the minerals or the elements that go into that manufacturing supply chain.
The lithium that,
exactly.
comes from Australia.
All of them,
yes.
all of them.
Yeah,
lithium, iron ore, steel.
Right. We've got all of the
silicon,
ingredients here, the aluminum, everything. Right.
Everything's sitting there in the ground.
Right.
And I think one of the things sometimes we forget is mining sort of gets demonized. I mean, mining is an enormous opportunity for these new industries and these new technologies, and capturing that value is a huge opportunity. The cost base is shifting. So, to go back to solar panels as an example, in the last 12 months, the cost of a solar panel has gone up by about 50%. That's because of logistics. So if you think of COVID, if you think of Russia, Ukraine, China, shipping costs are going through the roof. We have all those resources here. We have a lot of the talent. If you're not shipping across those supply chains, before you even get to any geostrategic, political risk type issues, just the cost issue, that drives down the cost base for that sort of manufacturing to happen in Australia. And what we're seeing is the cost base in other jurisdictions rise. So in China, labour costs are always going to be lower than ours, but they're certainly getting higher. And automation is helping to deliver better productivity outcomes here. So I'm quietly very optimistic that there's an amazing opportunity for us as a country to seize these more high-impact, advanced manufacturing industries, drawing on everything that we've already got. I think it's really up for us to seize that opportunity.
Wyatt Roy, Tech Council Australia, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Well, thanks, Lawrence. That was Wyatt Roy from the Tech Council. Now let's take a look at this topic through the lens of an investor. How do we think about the risks posed by data security to listed companies? How are executives and boards managing this growing risk? And importantly, can they insure against it? Well, joining me now in the studio are Louise McElvogue, who is an industry professor at UTS in data and digital and is a non-executive director on boards, including Health Direct Australia and Cluey Learning. Now we also have Troy Filipcevic. He's the CEO of Emergence, which is an insurer specializing in cyber and is part of the Steadfast Group. Welcome to you both, Troy, Louise. Louise, I'll start with you though, because after such an extraordinary year in terms of very high-profile hacks, what has sort of changed in terms of the expectations for the level of knowledge and understanding at the board and executive level as we move into 2023?
Yeah, I think it's been a while in the director community that the concept that you have to understand technology the same way you have to understand financial. So you have to be financially literate and you have to be technology literate. And probably getting to the technology levels has taken a little longer for some directors. And some boards may have, focused on perhaps having one director who has a technology background. But now I think people are very focused at the board level on the cyber risks and understanding what we need to be able to ask and how we need to ask it. So simple things from a board point of view are like, what data do we collect? Why do we collect the data? And is it encrypted? And from that, if you ask those sorts of questions in a boardroom, you start to get a cascading effect of what you need to know from that.
Yes, because you've got to think that with the Optus hack, the Medibank hack, there would have been a collective in boardrooms across the nation. So specifically, are these boards asking those questions of the CISOs, the CTOs? Do they have to look externally as well?
So I think there has been a collective there, but for the grace of God goes me, but this has been going on for quite some time. And, you know, the toll hack quite some time ago, which was a very strong ransomware attack, but also the JB Meats attack, where they did actually pay a ransom, one of the ones we know about publicly. So boards have been prepared for some time. The AICD just put out an excellent guide to cyber principles for boards. I think people have been asking these questions in a different way. I feel actually extremely sorry for the CTOs of most companies at the moment, because every board I'm on, if they haven't run a simulation, they're running one right now, and they're asking these questions of CEOs, CTOs, CISOs, but actually more broadly of the whole company. And that's probably the gap that you see from a board level, is that perhaps just one part of the company is dealing with this, when in fact it's a whole of company responsibility. And people talk about cyber resilience in a way, and everyone does phishing exercises to try and trick people up, but actually that cyber resilience and changing the culture around cybersecurity goes across the company in so many ways. From someone who's developing the code and the way they're doing that in a secure way, the way they're releasing it, through to the way the finance department is moving data around. So I think that change has been coming from the board for at least the last year, but certainly there's a huge focus on it right now.
Troy, to you, clearly you're speaking with executives and no doubt board members as well. How has this conversation around the depth of knowledge and understanding of cyber risks been evolving from your point of view?
It used to be a technology problem. Now it's a business problem. And what we're seeing is that everyone's invested and wanting to know more. So we're seeing boards and directors and exec asking questions around what's involved, do we have an incident response plan in place, who is responsible for what data do we have, but also I think one of the things that's fallen out of the Optus and the Medibank breaches is that only hold data that you need. And
for the time period that you need it.
Yes, and if you hold it, make sure that you encrypt it and you protect that as much as you can, because it's the livelihood of your customers that you're trying to protect. So we're seeing a lot of focus on that. We're also seeing people start to think about simulations, running disaster recovery sessions around, okay, how do we continue to run the business as we're dealing with these crises? Because it's a massive problem, and we're starting to see that, and I feel really sorry for Medibank and Optus, because the spotlight's cast on them. But this isn't a new problem. This has been around for years. These two recent breaches have just brought it to life, and when you see it on the 6 o'clock news and the general public now starting to take notice, you're really seeing that it's now starting to become prominent and top of mind for everyone.
Yeah, so boards, Louise, in thinking about the new privacy legislation amendment bill, so implicitly, again, this means that the government views that the damages being suffered by businesses is not incentive enough, right? Penalties could be up to $50 million for repeated breaches. So is that part and parcel what's focusing boards' attention now?
I think it definitely has an impact, because if you look at, if we're talking about these major breaches we've seen in the last month or two, the financial damage is enormous from that. So the $50 million fine isn't really going to touch the sides of what's happened to those brands and the cost of technology and the cost of recovery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, not every breach is a massive, hold you to ransom, lock up your system thing. There can be small amounts of data taken. And if there isn't a proper penalty, I think many businesses may try and ignore that. So we brought in the notifiable data breach, but actually some of the penalties we had in this country compared to the GDPR in Europe were far too low. Mm-hmm. So I think moving the dial on that penalty is helpful to focus businesses' minds.
Can I get a view from the board level on ransomware and paying ransomware attacks? Because obviously they're growing right across all sectors of the economy, big and more mid-market, small market. So what is the accepted view at the board level when it comes to paying ransom?
Well, it's a really interesting question, because you can say ethically, I do not want to pay a ransom. I think it's wrong. I think it encourages criminal behaviour. However, if your entire business is locked up, and as an example, the government is thinking about ransomware and bringing in legislation that makes it illegal or criminal in some way. And the message coming out is do not pay the ransomware. But if you're critical infrastructure, you can work, you're not actually held by that. That's going to be the plan. So at what point is it more important that the hospitals keep running and we need to pay the ransomware? Everybody talks ethically about we would not pay it, we would not pay it, but I think it's a very grey area, and I don't think you can actually say anything black or white about it. And it's very interesting, one of my boards, we were having this discussion because, like every other board in Australia, we've done a simulation and said where are the gaps, etc., etc. And when we got to the ransomware piece, the question was, well, what is our ransomware policy? Nobody in the room knew. And then it got to the next part, which was, but hang on, aren't we insured for ransomware? So why wouldn't we pay it? If we're paying insurance for it, why wouldn't we pay it? And then it was a question of actually legally, are we allowed to go and borrow that money because we don't have the cash and the insurance comes in afterwards? So it's a very messy picture that you get from a board point of view. And many, many boards have cyber insurance and are paying ransomware insurance. So
as an insurer, do you want these ransom being paid?
Look, it's entirely up to the board to make that decision. We cover ransom and we cover the payment of ransom. But when you think about cyber breaches, ransomware is just one subsection of a broader issue. Ransomware gets a lot of airplay because you're paying ransom. It is not illegal in Australia to pay a ransom. It is an option for boards to consider. And yes, we insure them, but the decision whether to pay or not is up to the board. Now, a number of factors come into play for this. So things like, do they have a backup, and is that backup okay? If it is, then the board can ignore the ransom and they can go about building the business back up and running, restoring from backups, and away they go. However, if all their backups encrypted, if critical infrastructure is involved, if customers are down, then it is an option to pay the ransom. And in a lot of the times where we've been involved in paying the ransom on behalf of our clients, we've got the data back. Yes, you run the risk of not doing that. However, in our experience, they get the data and they get back up and running.
I feel like this is unfair to say to you both in about 30 seconds or less. I mean, take us through the process. What should play out ideally when some sort of a cyber incident occurs? What is the first sort of port of call? How should things go?
Well, of course, we'd all pull our special guide out, which is our playbook, which we've practiced in a simulation. Yep. From a board point of view, the chair will be hearing about it from someone on the front line. You'll be trying to determine what has happened. You'll be trying to isolate what has happened. You'll be trying to remedy what has happened, and then at the same time, you'll have a parallel process where you're thinking about the communication to stakeholders, to regulators, and to your customers.
And your playbook?
Well, we're part of the playbook. Mm-hmm. So cyber insurance is different to other insurances where you actually get access to help and experts. So we have an incident response team that's 24/7. When a ransomware payment comes in or there's been a brute force attack on the business, they ring us and we help guide them through the process. Because a lot of the times, CEOs haven't been exposed to this before. It's totally new. When you've got staff trying to log into computers of a morning and they've all been encrypted and they can't, like, stress levels are at an all-time high. So that's where when we work with boards and senior management teams that buy insurance, we sit down with them and we come up with an incident response plan. So we know what vendors we're going to use, what experts we're going to pull in, who's responsible for what. So at the head of the battle, we're very calm, we're making the right decisions to get that company up and running as quickly as possible.
Troy, Louise, I'm going to just pause our discussion here for a moment because I'd like to move on to a bigger question, which is whether cyber and cyber resilience will become a core screen for investors, similar to what has occurred over time with ESG, but also, is cyber resilience actually part of that whole ESG equation. I spoke with Gerry Glombicki. He's a senior director at Fitch, and he runs a global team of analysts feeding cyber into Fitch's ratings analysis. He's based in Chicago. I spoke with him a little bit earlier on just to talk about where Australia fits in with this global cyber risk environment to start.
So it's interesting. MIT recently put out a study with Code 42. They looked at the top 20 economies and their cyber defense index. Australia ranked number 1 in terms of that economy type stuff. So what you're actually seeing is Australia is fairly advanced on several regards. Despite having several large instances of cyber events recently, it's very complicated because cyber threat actors are motivated by either cash, notoriety, or trying to become more intense with actual actions that they can do. And Australia has provided an environment for them to do that recently, but doesn't necessarily mean that they're underprepared.
Well, that's an interesting point because we have seen some very high profile cyber attacks here lately. Obviously the big ones, Optus and Medibank, come to mind in particular. Is it fair to say that Australia has been disproportionately targeted? I mean, what would make Australian corporates, an attractive target, so to speak?
So again, cash is the biggest thing, and ransomware actors want to get paid. That's the biggest thing that they're trying to go after, is they're trying to monetize their criminal activity. And to the extent you can do that, that's exactly what that underground economy is thriving upon. That's what they want to try to do. Notoriety is another one. Again, you want to try to become noticeable to the extent you can do this stuff, to the extent you can become more prominent in your role, even just building credibility. And the other one's chaos. Some people just want to disrupt things, not even to get motivated by it. And those are the ones that are a lot more trickier to attack the problem for it, because chaos is their motivation. They're not motivated by anything that really a rational actor would be at that point in time.
Is it any way, I know that you said it wasn't necessarily a reflection of corporates' defenses, but is it also potentially a reflection of the penalties and the accountability that are making these organizations, such an attractive target?
That's a great question. And ultimately, you're right, you hit the nail on the head on two things. The first is accountability. To the extent that executive management has to start signing off on cyber risk and accountability of cyber risk, it now becomes an IT problem or an information security problem, up to a management level problem, to a board level problem. And that's really where it belongs. Cybersecurity should be talked about and managed at the board level. It is no longer just an information technology or an information security problem overall. The second part of that is actually fines and penalties that you mentioned as well. So to the extent that the fines and penalties increase, now cyber events actually have a bigger cost to the company. Because without actually a component holding anybody accountable for these events will perpetuate in perpetuity.
How much cyber-specific data has Fitch been using recently that really feeds into the rating process?
So Fitch actually has a partnership with Security Scorecard to look at companies' cyber posture ahead of the times. So what Security Scorecard does is it's passive telemetry. It just looks at a company's footprint. It looks at its DNS profile and kind of grade the companies on an A through an F, A being the best, F being the worst. We have access to that, and then we can talk to companies' management about this. Now, it's passive telemetry. It's just a portion of it. It's not active telemetry, and there's other things around it. The biggest threat vector of all cyber attack is actually humans. So it doesn't regard that element of it, but nonetheless, it gives Fitch some insight into the cybersecurity culture and posture of a company.
So it's not necessarily then ratings would be damaged because of a hack. It can more likely be traced if there was potentially some sort of a downgrade to, the overall approach to cybersecurity and risk.
It's a great question. So there's three things first I should take one step back. The first time there's a cyber event, we treat it as an event risk. We do not believe that you can actually predict a cyber event ahead of time, either in terms of frequency and or severity. So we have to kind of take each hack on its own systemic individual abilities. Now, a series of small ones can add up to a big event as well. So we'll look at it both in total as well as the past history of it. But the things we're looking at the first is the effect on capital, the effect on profitability, and its effect or damage on brand profile. Those are the three primary things that we're looking at, as well as how much headroom does the company have relative to its rating sensitivities. So those are what we're looking at for each one of those events, but recognize that a series of events can add up to a large event, even if individually they don't add up to a rating action in of itself.
Okay, how does cyber risk and cyber preparedness feed into ESG ratings coming from Fitch?
It's a great question. So really, ESG can be pointing to two things. The first is really governance. Governance is really all of it. It matters both for the environmental side, societal side, as well as the governance side. So any attack can also be blamed on poor governance. And particularly what Fitch does is we use something called the Sustainable Accounting Standard Board's framework for ESG. And in particular for the societal part, they have a section on there for data privacy and customer controls of it. So to the extent there's any breach of personal information, personal health information, it could be a damage to both the societal aspect score, so the S part, as well as the G score for governance.
Has Fitch ever downgraded a company's ratings based solely on a cybersecurity event?
No, is the short answer. So we have not taken any rating action for a company to date on that. We've changed some ESG scores. In particular, we changed one for Capital One and Desjardins. We did elevate the ESG scores relative to their cyber events, but to actually take a rating action yet, we have not done so.
Do you anticipate you will be more active on that front in the future, considering not just what we're seeing now in terms of targeted events here in Australia, but when you take the global geopolitical context into consideration as well, and I'm thinking, Russia, Ukraine, how do you anticipate that will feed into the work that you're doing there at Fitch?
So I think what you're seeing is cyber risk is increasing. It's not decreasing. So that's the first step. And just the past isn't predictive of the future, which is one of the hard things when we talk about modeling it. You can't necessarily look back and say over the past year, the past 3 years, or the past 5 years. The cyber attacks are always advancing in both frequency as well as severity of attacks, and they're becoming harder to detect. The other thing, and you kind of mentioned this as well, is there's a difference between what we call information technology and operational technology. And operational technology are things that actually power things like manufacturing plants, oil and gas, refineries, things like water treatment facilities. To the extent you have an attack on that, that's a lot more severe than it is on an information technology side. Also, not all sectors are created equal. Things, for example, like financial institutions are a lot more sensitive to an attack than, for an example, a municipality or some type of state-run organization where they might have limited information at that point in time. So you have to look at each one of these on its merits. But as you start seeing more sophisticated attacks and on critical infrastructure, you're starting to see a bigger impact to the potential rating impacts.
And Gerry, resiliency is something that we continue to return to in the cybersecurity conversation. I mean, that's not easy to achieve, particularly when we are faced with budgetary pressures, the looming threat of recession as well. Would you agree at Fitch?
That's absolutely true. So as recessions come into focus, cybersecurity budgets are also coming into focus as well. And to the extent there's any cuts in the cybersecurity budget, it makes it more harder for your next dollar to spend to keep your actual level of sophistication okay. So the first thing you're seeing is just basically a regulatory spend. If you have a regulatory hurdle that you have to meet and achieve, that's the first thing that you'll do. Over and above that, it now becomes more difficult for boards and management to actually decide where you're going to spend that dollar. Because to ultimate cyber resiliency, there's a cost to that. And ultimately, it comes down to spending your dollars wisely, both on the profitability side to actually make money, but also on your defensive side to keep things. And one of the hardest things in cyber to do is try to calculate a return on investment. I think it's pretty much difficult, if not impossible, to do that. But actually having a sophisticated cybersecurity and mature posture and cyber culture is what's key.
That was Gerry Glombicki there joining us from Fitch Ratings. Louise, just to get your thoughts on that, as at board level, you need to be across the financials, you need to be across cyber risk and technology as well. But as we've just heard there, really intertwined.
Yes, and I'd love to know how they could actually rate a company on its cyber, because based on the fact of the number of hacks we've seen recently, many of those companies had got a complete tick on many levels about their cyber health. And it is social engineering as your interviewee mentioned, so that part of it you can't control. I'm not sure that it is actually that effective to try and guess which company will be hacked and which company won't. And in fact, these days, the stance from boards is we will do everything we can to make sure we're as safe as we can, but we assume we're going to get attacked. So looking forward and understanding who you think may be attacked and adjusting your ratings based on that, I'm not sure is that effective. I thought it was interesting that Australia is number one in terms of targets. And I think anyone who's worked offshore will see the very big difference in the way we collect data on customers here, the right to be forgotten that exists in many other countries, even just the opt-in that is everything you sign up for here, you have to opt in. Every other, well, European countries at least, it's opt out. So that whole approach to data governance and privacy and the right to be forgotten is quite unsophisticated in Australia, which could possibly make it a goldmine for people offshore.
Interesting. And just a final question. I mean, do you think that in the future we could see ASIC or some other governing body start to mandate that board members, board directors, report on a preventative sort of cybersecurity, cyber safe metric, which would then, put another impost on directors as well?
Well, ASIC has already brought cases against people in terms of cyber readiness, in terms of data privacy more than cyber readiness. And they have put directors on notice that this is something they're looking at. So I don't think it's a maybe. I think it's happening already.
Got it. Now, can we speak, Troy, about what's happening in the reinsurance market when it comes to cyber? I mean, what is happening with pricing in this environment?
Pricing gets a lot of airplay, but in reality, if a company isn't doing the right things and putting the right measures in place, they will either not get insurance or they'll pay a lot for it. Over the last few years, the headline is cyber used to be hard to sell. Now it's hard to buy. And the reason why it's hard to buy is because all of these losses are coming through. And if boards and companies aren't investing in cybersecurity infrastructure, such as endpoint protection, training staff, backing up, the data that needs to be backed up, is it encrypted, etc., etc. If companies aren't doing that, then they will struggle to get insurance. So you're starting to see insurance companies be quite discerning around who they will insure and who they won't. And price is just part of that equation. But just going back, the human element in this is huge. So looking at scorecards and rating engines, I'm just scratching the surface, but it's the human element that's the major issue around this. I read an article the other day where human error was responsible for a number of the hacks. So it's more about the culture of the business. Is it being driven by the top? How do they talk about it? Is it awareness all the time? Is there training? Are there roles, risk and procedures in place? Is it embedded in the organisation rather than just scan some external ports and come up with a score? It's meaningless. It needs to be. It's a business problem, which is what I said at the start. And everyone, from board level all the way down, needs to buy in.
Needs to be in the DNA. Look, this is a conversation we will be picking up in 2023, no doubt. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
That was Louise McElvogue and Troy Filipcevic joining us there. Now that is Crisis Control for this year. Thank you for watching this special edition. The program will return in 2023 and we look forward to seeing you then.
Crisis Control, brought to you by Xerilio. Cybersecurity experts protecting Australian businesses and organisations so we can all be safer together.